Woman returns from death with a terrifying message from Jesus. The rain was falling harder than I'd ever seen it that Thursday morning. Sarah, my 11-year-old granddaughter, sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching her science project, a meticulously crafted model of the solar system she'd worked on for weeks. I remember glancing at her through the rearview mirror, her golden hair neatly braided, just like her mother Susan used to wear at that age. "Grandma," she said, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic beating of the windshield wipers, "do you think I'll win first place?" I smiled, though my eyes remained fixed on the treacherous mountain road ahead. "With all that hard work you put in? Sweetheart, you're already a winner in my..." That's when I saw a massive buck, frozen in my headlights, its eyes reflecting an almost supernatural glow. Time seemed to slow down as I processed my options, and a split second hit the deer and risk Sarah's life, or swerve and pray. I chose the latter. The steering wheel jerked violently under my hands as our SUV hydroplaned. Sarah's scream pierced the air as we spun once, twice, 3 times. The guardrail gave way like paper, and suddenly we were airborne. In that moment, I reached for Sarah, my fingers brushing against her arm as our world tilted sideways. "Jesus, protect her," I whispered as we plummeted down the ravine. The hospital room was a blur of fluorescent lights and urgent voices when I first opened my eyes. The steady beep of monitors filled the air, but something felt different wrong somehow. I could see Susan slumped in a chair, her face buried in her hands, while my son James stood by the window, his pastor's collar askew, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Time of death, 9:47 a.m. A doctor's voice echoed from somewhere nearby. That's when I realized they were talking about me. I wanted to reach out to tell them I was still here, but my body felt impossibly heavy. Then suddenly, everything changed. The room filled with a golden light that nobody else seemed to notice, and I felt myself being pulled away from my physical form. But just as quickly as it began, I was slammed back into my body with the force of 1,000 lightning bolts. I sat up with a gasp that sent medical instruments clattering to the floor. Susan screamed. James spun around, his face white as chalk. The medical staff froze in their tracks, mouths agape. Mom, Susan choked out, stumbling toward my bed. "Oh my God, Mom." "Mrs. Bennett, this is impossible," Dr. Reynolds muttered, frantically checking my vitals. "You were dead for over 7 minutes." I grabbed Susan's hand, my voice urgent but clear. "Where's Sarah? I need to see Sarah." The room fell silent. James stepped forward, his face a mask of anguish. "Mom, Sarah's in intensive care. They don't think she's going to make it." But I knew something they didn't. I had seen him, Jesus himself, and he had shown me things, terrible and wonderful things. Most importantly, he had given me a message, a mission that would either save or destroy my family. "Listen to me," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I died, yes. But I was sent back because there's something you all need to know. Jesus showed me everything. Sarah's not going to die, but what happens next depends on us, on our faith, on our choices." James turned away, his shoulders stiffening. "Mom, please. Not now. This isn't the time for..." "No, James," I interrupted, feeling a strength I'd never known before. "This is exactly the time. Because what I saw, what Jesus showed me, it changes everything." If this story has touched your heart and awakened something deep within your soul, join our spiritual journey by subscribing. Together, we'll explore more profound stories of faith, miracles, and divine encounters that could change your life forever. I never considered myself particularly special before that fateful day. At 70 years old, I was just Margaret Bennett, a widow living in the quiet town of Millbrook, Connecticut. My life revolved around my small Victorian house on Maple Street, my 2 children, and my beloved granddaughter Sarah. Faith had always been the cornerstone of my existence, though not in an ostentatious way. I attended Sunday services at First Baptist Church, where my son James used to preach before everything changed. My belief was quiet but unwavering, like a steady flame that neither blazed nor flickered. Every morning I'd sit in my garden with a cup of coffee and my worn Bible, finding peace in the familiar verses and the gentle morning light. My late husband, Thomas, had been gone for 5 years, but his presence still lingered in every corner of our home. The wooden rocking chair he'd made still sat on the porch, The garden he'd planted still bloomed every spring. He'd been a high school chemistry teacher, beloved by his students for his gentle manner and patient explanations. His death from cancer had been our family's first real test of faith. I'd raised my children to believe in God's love and mercy. Susan, my eldest, followed in my footsteps, her faith as natural as breathing. She worked as a nurse at Millbrook General, her compassion touching countless lives. James, though. James had been different. His faith had burned brighter than any of ours, leading him to become a pastor at just 28. The congregation loved his passionate sermons and modern approach to ministry. He had a way of making ancient scriptures feel relevant to today's world. Before the accident, my days had a comfortable rhythm. I volunteered at the church food bank on Tuesdays, taught Sunday school to the little ones, and spent my free time baking for various church functions. My coconut cream pie was legendary at potlucks, and my Christmas cookies were always the first to disappear at the annual holiday bazaar. Sarah was my special joy. From the moment she was born, we shared a unique bond. Unlike her cousins who preferred video games and social media, Sarah would spend hours with me in the garden, asking questions about everything from butterflies to biblical stories. She had her grandfather's curiosity and her father's gift for seeing God in the smallest details of creation. But beneath our family's peaceful surface, there were undercurrents of tension. James's wife had left him and Sarah 3 years ago, claiming she couldn't handle the pressures of being a pastor's wife. The divorce had shaken James's faith, though he hid it well behind passionate sermons and tireless community work. Only a mother could see the doubt growing in his eyes, the questions he wrestled with late at night. I worried about him, prayed for him constantly. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at Sarah during Sunday services, his expression torn between love and fear that she too might one day leave him, just like her mother. If I'd known then what I know now, perhaps I could have helped him more. But God's plans have a way of unfolding in their own time, and sometimes the greatest tests of faith come when we least expect them. Looking back now, I realize that every aspect of my life, my quiet faith, my family's struggles, my relationship with Sarah was preparing me for what was to come. God had been laying the groundwork for a miracle that would shake our family to its core and test everything we thought we knew about faith, love, and the thin line between life and death. The morning of the accident started like any other. I had no premonition, no divine warning of what was about to unfold. Isn't that how life's biggest moments often arrive? Not with thunder and lightning, but with the quiet normalcy of a rainy Thursday morning, a child's science project, and a grandmother's routine drive to school. But God had other plans for us that day, plans that would transform not just our family, but our entire understanding of faith and miracles. The complexity of our family relationships became painfully clear in the wake of my near-death experience. Like a delicate tapestry, each thread of connection revealed its strength or fragility under the strain of crisis. James, my beloved son, had once been the pride of our congregation. At 38, he still carried himself with the dignified bearing of a pastor, even after stepping down from the pulpit 6 months ago. His crisis of faith began subtly: a missed prayer meeting here, a skeptical comment there. The congregation whispered when he began questioning long-held doctrines during his sermons. "Why does God allow suffering?" he would ask, his voice echoing through the hushed sanctuary. "Where is divine mercy when innocent children die?" The final blow came when his wife, Rebecca, left. She'd packed her bags one Sunday afternoon while James was delivering his sermon about doubt and faith. The note she left was brief: "I married a man of God, not a man of questions." She didn't even say goodbye to Sarah. James found his daughter sitting alone on the front porch, clutching her stuffed angel, waiting for a mother who would never return. Susan, my daughter, became our family's anchor. At 42, she balanced her duties as head nurse at Millbrook General with being a surrogate mother to Sarah. Her faith remained unshakable, even as she watched her brothers crumble. "God has a plan," she would say, bringing casseroles to James's house and making sure Sarah had someone to talk to about girl things, but I saw the worry in her eyes, the way she lit an extra candle each Sunday for her brother's lost soul. Sarah, my precious granddaughter, carried burdens no 11-year-old should bear. She inherited James's sensitive spirit and Rebecca's artistic talent, but also a wisdom beyond her years. Sometimes I'd find her in the church garden, talking to the flowers as if they were messengers to heaven. "Please tell Mom I'm doing okay," she'd whisper to the roses, "and tell God to help Daddy smile again." the relationships between them were equally complex. James and Susan, once inseparable as children, now circled each other cautiously, their conversations carefully avoiding anything deeper than weather and weekly schedules. Susan couldn't understand her brother's doubts. James resented his sister's unwavering faith. "It's easy for you," he once snapped during a family dinner. "You haven't lost everything you believed in." Yet they remained bound by their love for Sarah. James might question God's existence, but he never missed his daughter's school events. Susan might disapprove of her brother's spiritual wandering, but she fiercely defended him against congregation gossip. They were like two planets orbiting the bright sun of Sarah's innocence, held together by gravity they couldn't escape. Before the accident, these tensions simmered beneath a veneer of normalcy. We still gathered for Sunday dinners, celebrated birthdays, and maintained the appearances of a close-knit family. But there were cracks growing wider by the day. James stopped saying grace before meals. Susan started taking Sarah to church without telling her brother. And I watched, helpless, as my family quietly splintered along fault lines of faith and doubt. I spent countless nights on my knees, praying for healing that seemed impossible. Lord, I would plead, bring my son back to you. Help my children find their way back to each other. Little did I know that God's answer to these prayers would come in a way none of us could have imagined through my own death and return. Now, as I lay in this hospital bed with a message from Jesus himself, I understand that our family's brokenness was preparation for something greater. Every crack in our relationships, every question of faith, every tear shed and silent prayers, all of it was leading to this moment. God hadn't abandoned us. He was setting the stage for a miracle that would require all of our wounds to be laid bare before healing could begin. Death wasn't what I expected. There was no long tunnel, no peaceful light beckoning me forward. Instead, I felt myself being pulled through what I can only describe as a vortex of golden energy, my soul spinning through dimensions I never knew existed. The force was both terrifying and exhilarating, like being caught in a spiritual whirlpool that stripped away every earthly concern. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. I found myself in a place that defied description, a realm where light wasn't just visible but tangible, where colors had sounds and emotions had form. The air itself seemed alive with divine energy, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the very heartbeat of creation. That's when I saw him. Jesus didn't appear as the gentle figure from Sunday school paintings. His presence was overwhelming, radiating a power that brought me to my knees. His eyes held the depth of eternity, filled with a love so intense it was almost unbearable. When he looked at me, I felt every moment of my life laid bare, every kindness, every failing, every silent prayer and unspoken doubt. "Margaret," he spoke, and his voice resonated through my entire being. It wasn't just sound, it was pure truth vibrating through the fabric of reality. "Your time is not yet finished." I wanted to speak, to ask the 1,000 questions that had plagued humanity for millennia, but in his presence, all those questions seemed to dissolve. Understanding flowed into me like a river of light. I saw the interconnectedness of all things, the perfect pattern of God's plan unfolding across time and space. He showed me visions that seared themselves into my soul. I saw Sarah, my precious granddaughter, suspended between life and death, her spirit tethered by the thinnest of threads. I saw James, my son, standing at a crossroads of faith, his decisions rippling out to affect not just our family but countless others. I witnessed Susan's unwavering faith, a beacon in the gathering darkness. "Your family stands at a precipice," Jesus said, his words carrying the weight of divine authority. "The enemy seeks to destroy not just their faith, but their very souls. You have been chosen, Margaret, to stand in the gap." The visions continued, showing me two possible futures. In one, I saw my family whole again, their faith restored and strengthened through trial. In the other, I witnessed a darkness consuming them, starting with James and spreading like a spiritual cancer. The stakes became crystal clear. This wasn't just about one family's faith, it was a battle for souls. But Lord, I finally found my voice, though it trembled in his presence. "I'm just a grandmother. What can I do against such darkness?" His smile held both infinite compassion and unshakable strength. "You are my servant, chosen for this time. Through your death and return, many will see my power. Through your words, hearts will be turned. Through your love, faith will be restored." He reached out and touched my forehead, and in that moment, divine knowledge flooded my consciousness. I understood that my near-death experience wasn't an accident, it was a commissioning. Every detail of my life had been preparation for this mission. Remember, his voice grew urgent. The enemy will not surrender easily. You will face doubt, ridicule, and opposition, even from those you love most. But I am with you always, even to the end of the age. The golden light began to pulse more intensely, and I felt myself being drawn back toward life. But before the heavenly realm faded, Jesus gave me one final message. Tell them, Margaret, tell them that faith is not the absence of doubt, but the courage to believe despite it. Tell them that love is stronger than death, and that miracles still happen to those who dare to believe. As I was pulled back toward my earthly body, I carried with me not just a message, but a divine purpose that would change everything. The grandmother who died on that rainy Thursday morning was not the same person who would return to life. The vision Jesus shared with me was both beautiful and terrifying in its clarity. He showed me two distinct paths our family, and by extension, humanity, could take. The message wasn't just about spiritual matters, it was about the very essence of human connection in an increasingly disconnected world. In the first vision, I saw our family restored. Sarah was awake and vibrant, her face glowing with the kind of joy that only comes from complete healing, both physical and spiritual. James stood in his pulpit again, but this time his sermons weren't just words, they were testimonies born from his own journey through doubt and redemption. His face shone with the kind of peace that comes only after weathering life's fiercest storms. Susan was there too, her role as family healer transformed into something greater. I saw her leading prayer groups, helping others navigate their own crises of faith. The bond between the siblings was stronger than ever, forged in the fire of shared trials and mutual understanding. Most importantly, I saw love, pure, unconditional love flowing between all of us, healing old wounds and bridging seemingly impossible gaps. But then the vision shifted, and the beauty turned to ashes. I saw the second possible future, and it chilled me to my soul. In this reality, Sarah never woke up. Her physical death became the death of James's last remnant of faith. I watched my son spiral into darkness, his heart hardening not just against God, but against all forms of love and hope. He became a leader of a different kind, gathering followers who shared his bitterness, spreading spiritual poison disguised as enlightenment. Susan wasn't spared either. In trying to save her brother, she began to question her own faith. The light in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a haunted look of someone who had seen their worst fears realized. Our family didn't just drift apart, it shattered, each piece becoming a weapon that wounded the others. This, Jesus told me, his voice filled with both sorrow and determination, is why you must go back. The enemy knows that destroying one family's faith can create ripples that affect countless others. Your family has been chosen not just for your own salvation, but as a beacon of hope for others facing similar battles. He showed me how our story would touch others, doctors who would witness Sarah's miraculous recovery, nurses who would see Susan's unwavering faith, congregation members who would watch James's journey back to God. Even the media attention would serve a purpose, spreading the message of hope and redemption to those who needed it most. The message was clear: faith isn't just personal, it's generational. The choices we make, the beliefs we hold or abandon, affect not just us but those who come after us. Jesus showed me how James's crisis of faith wasn't just about him, it was about every parent who had ever questioned God's goodness in the face of suffering, every child who had ever felt abandoned, every family torn apart by doubt and pain. Remember this, Jesus said as the vision began to fade. True faith is not about having all the answers. It's about trusting even when the questions seem overwhelming. Tell them that I haven't abandoned them. Tell them that every tear, every doubt, every moment of anger, I see it all. And I can use it all for good. The final part of the message was the most crucial: love is the key. Not just spiritual love, but practical, everyday love shown through actions and choices. I saw how small acts of kindness could turn the tide of despair, how persistent love could soften the hardest heart, how forgiveness could break chains that seemed unbreakable. As I felt myself being pulled back to life, I clutched these visions close to my heart. I knew the road ahead would be difficult. Convincing a skeptical world and my own skeptical son of what I had seen would be no easy task. But I also knew that I carried within me now, not just a message, but a divine mandate to show that faith, hope, and love are not just religious concepts, but powerful forces that can transform even the darkest circumstances into testimony of God's grace. My return to the physical world was violent and disorienting, like being thrust back into a body that had forgotten how to live. The hospital room exploded into chaos as monitors suddenly blared back to life. Dr. Reynolds, who had just pronounced me dead, dropped his clipboard with a clatter that seemed to echo through the stunned silence that followed. "Impossible," he whispered, his professional composure cracking as he watched my vital signs stabilize on the monitor. She was gone. No pulse, no brain activity, for 7 minutes and 13 seconds. Susan's tears of grief transformed into tears of joy as she clutched my hand. "Mom? Mom? Can you hear me?" Her voice trembled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. But James, my James, stood frozen by the window, his pastor's collar askew, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The room soon filled with medical staff, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of scientific terminology and amazed exclamations. Blood pressure readings, heart rate monitors, neurological checks, all confirming that I was, indeed, very much alive. But their words felt distant, unimportant compared to the urgent message burning in my soul. "Sarah," I managed to say, my voice stronger than it should have been after what I'd been through. "Where is Sarah?" The room fell silent again. Susan's grip on my hand tightened. "Mom," she said gently, "Sarah's in ICU. The doctors, they're doing everything they can." But I knew something they didn't. I tried to sit up, fighting against the weakness in my limbs. "Listen to me," I insisted. "I was with Jesus. He showed me everything. Sarah's going to live, but only if we..." A violent coughing fit interrupted my words, my body rebelling against this sudden return to life. James finally moved from his spot by the window, but instead of coming closer, he backed toward the door. "Mom, you're confused. The trauma, the lack of oxygen. It's normal to have vivid hallucinations and near-death experiences." His voice carried the rational tone he used for counseling grieving parishioners, but I could hear the tremor beneath it. "This wasn't a hallucination, James," I said firmly, looking directly into his eyes. "Jesus showed me why this happened. He showed me what's at stake, not just for Sarah, but for all of us. For you." The monitors began beeping more rapidly as my heart rate increased. Dr. Reynolds stepped forward, concern etching his features. "Mrs. Bennett, you need to stay calm. Your body has been through an incredible trauma." But how could I stay calm? The weight of my divine mission pressed against my chest more heavily than any physical ailment. I could see the battle lines being drawn already: science versus faith, reason versus revelation, a son's doubt versus a mother's certainty. Strange things began happening in the room. The lights flickered, though no one else seemed to notice. A warm breeze swept through the space, despite the closed windows, carrying with it the faint scent of roses, the same scent that had surrounded Jesus during our encounter. "James," I called out as he reached for the door handle. "He told me about your prayers, the ones you still whisper late at night when you think no one can hear, about how you beg for a sign, any sign that he's still listening." My son froze, his hand trembling on the door. Susan gasped softly. She hadn't known about those prayers. None of us had. James turned back slowly, his face pale. "How could you know that?" he whispered. "Because he knows, James. He's always known. And all of this is your sign. But you have to choose to see it. Sarah's life depends on that choice." The tension in the room was palpable. Medical staff stood awkwardly, witnesses to a family drama they couldn't understand. Dr. Reynolds cleared his throat, ready to intervene, but before he could speak, the hospital's PAW system crackled to life. "Code blue, pediatric ICU. Code blue, pediatric ICU." James's face drained of what little color remained. We all knew where Sarah was. As he rushed from the room, I called after him, "Faith isn't the absence of doubt, James. It's the courage to believe despite it." The message from Jesus burned in my heart as I watched my son run toward his daughter's room. This was just the beginning of our battle, a battle not just for Sarah's life, but for James's soul, for our family's future, and for something even greater that I was only beginning to understand. The code blue in Sarah's room marked the beginning of my son's darkest hour. I couldn't be there physically. The doctors insisted I stay in bed, but Susan rushed to the pediatric ICU, leaving me to pray and wrestle with the weight of what I knew was coming. James stood helplessly in the hallway, watching through the glass as medical staff fought to stabilize his daughter. His face reflected a war between the pastor he had been and the bitter skeptic he was becoming. I later learned that as the doctors worked, he did something he hadn't done in months. He prayed. Not the eloquent prayers of his sermons, but raw, desperate pleas punctuated by tears. God, if you're there. If Mom's really seen what she claims, please don't take my Sarah too. Sarah survived that crisis, but remained in a coma. The doctors couldn't explain why her condition kept fluctuating, improving one moment, crashing the next. But I understood. Jesus had shown me that her life hung in the balance of her father's faith. The next few days revealed the depth of James's spiritual crisis. He stopped wearing his clerical collar completely, started missing church services. Members of the congregation would stop by, offering prayers and casseroles, but he turned them away with increasing hostility. Prayers, I overheard him snap at Mrs. Anderson, our church's longest-serving member. Where were your prayers when Rebecca left? Where were they when Sarah? His voice broke, and he slammed the door before finishing the sentence. Then came the night that changed everything. I was finally allowed to visit Sarah's room, wheeled in by Susan. James sat by his daughter's bed, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. The monitors beeped steadily, marking each precious heartbeat. You know what I realized, Mom, he said without looking up. If God exists, he's either cruel or powerless. Either he can't help Sarah, or he won't. And I don't know which is worse. Or I responded gently, he's waiting for you to remember who you are, who he made you to be. James laughed bitterly. The faithful pastor? That man died when his wife walked out. When his daughter, he gestured helplessly at Sarah's still form. That's when I noticed a book on his lap, not his Bible, but something else. The cover read Religious Trauma and Recovery, Breaking Free from Spiritual Abuse. My heart sank as I recognized it. The book was written by Marcus Green, a former pastor who now led a support group for survivors of religious indoctrination. James, I said carefully, what exactly have you been reading? Truth, Mom. Real truth. Marcus's group, they understand. They've been where I am. They know how toxic blind faith can be. His eyes took on a feverish gleam. Did you know Marcus had experiences like yours, near-death visions? But he realized they were just chemical reactions in a dying brain. He helped me see that all of this your experience, these signs, they're just our minds trying to make sense of randomness. Susan, who had been quiet until then, spoke up. James, you can't seriously be considering joining that group. They're not about healing, they're about hatred. They're about freedom. James stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. Freedom from the guilt, the constant pressure to believe in a God who lets children suffer while their grandmothers have convenient visions of hope. The monitors attached to Sarah began beeping more rapidly. James didn't seem to notice, but I did. I remembered Jesus' warning about the forces that would try to pull my son further into darkness. Your doubt isn't the problem, James, I said, my voice carrying a strength that made both my children turn to look at me. It's what you're choosing to fill that doubt with. Marcus Green isn't offering you freedom, he's offering you permission to give up. Something flickered in James's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or fear. But before he could respond, one of the monitors erupted in a shrill alarm. Sarah's body began to convulse. No, James rushed to her side as medical staff flooded the room. As they pushed him back, I saw him pull something from his pocket and throw it desperately onto Sarah's bed, his old pastor's collar.
In that moment, watching my son's last vestige of faith land like a white flag of surrender on his daughter's hospital bed, I understood the true scale of the battle ahead. This wasn't just about saving Sarah's life, or even James's faith. It was about a father's soul teetering on the edge of an abyss and the dark forces waiting to push him over.
Word of my resurrection spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The local newspaper ran the headline, "Local Woman Returns from Death with Divine Message," while some called it a miracle. Others demanded scientific explanations. Dr. Reynolds found himself besieged by colleagues demanding medical records and rational explanations for something that defied rational understanding. The hospital corridor outside my room became a battleground of opposing beliefs. Church members gathered for impromptu prayer sessions, their hymns floating through the halls, while skeptics and curiosity seekers lurked nearby, whispering about mass hysteria and religious delusion. Susan tried to maintain order, but the tension was palpable. Mrs. Bennett, a young reporter named Michael Chase, cornered me one afternoon during my physical therapy session. "There are rumors that you've been experiencing strange phenomena since your return." care to comment. He wasn't wrong. Inexplicable things had been happening. Lights would flicker when I spoke about my experience. Room temperatures would drop suddenly. Patients in nearby rooms reported hearing hymns when no one was singing. One nurse swore she saw a golden glow surrounding my bed during night shifts. The only phenomenon that matters, I told him firmly, is that my granddaughter still needs prayers. But the media attention only intensified. A producer from a national religious network called, wanting to feature my story. A Skeptics podcast dedicated an entire episode to debunking my alleged resurrection. The hospital had to post security guards to keep away both zealous believers seeking blessings and determined debunkers armed with scientific equipment. James's involvement with Marcus Green's group deepened, bringing new complications. Marcus himself came to Millbrook, setting up a temporary office to support those questioning toxic faith. His presence sparked immediate controversy. Church members picketed his meetings, while his followers accused them of harassment. The worst came during a particularly heated confrontation outside the hospital. Marcus's group had set up an information table near the entrance, displaying books about breaking free from religious manipulation. Our church's prayer group was holding their daily vigil nearby. The tension finally broke when Mrs. Anderson, in a moment of uncharacteristic fury, overturned the table. "You're killing that poor girl," she screamed at Marcus. "Her life depends on faith, and you're stealing it from her father." The incident made the local news, forcing the hospital administration to ban all religious and anti-religious gatherings from the premises. The battle lines were drawn more starkly than ever: faith versus doubt, miracle versus science, traditional beliefs versus modern skepticism. Meanwhile, my own condition puzzled the medical staff. My recovery defied their expectations: too rapid, too complete. Physical therapy sessions meant to take weeks were accomplished in days. The massive internal trauma from the accident seemed to heal overnight. Dr. Reynolds eventually stopped trying to explain it in his reports, simply writing recovery exceeds medical expectations. But the most disturbing development was the effect all this had on our family. Susan threw herself into defending my story, becoming almost militant in her faith. She got into heated arguments with James's new friends, even creating a website called Margaret's Miracle to counter their skepticism. "They're trying to erase God from our story," she insisted when I suggested she might be going too far. "Someone has to stand up for the truth." James, in response, retreated further into Marcus's teachings. He started hosting recovery meetings in his home, gathering others who'd left their faith. The same passion that once made him a compelling preacher now fueled his arguments against religion. The strain showed in small ways. Sunday dinners ceased. Family photos disappeared from James's walls. Susan and James stopped speaking except about Sarah's medical care, and even then, their interactions were tense and clinical. I watched it all from my hospital room, my heart breaking as Jesus' warning played out before my eyes. The enemy was using our own love against us, twisting our concerns for each other into weapons that drove us apart. Every time James visited Sarah, he had to pass the prayer groups in the hallway. Every time Susan checked Sarah's vitals, she had to see the books from Marcus's group on James's bedside table. One night, as I sat alone in my room wrestling with the weight of it all, I felt Jesus' presence again. No visions this time, just a warm certainty and a whispered reminder: "Remember, Margaret, sometimes things must break completely before they can be remade stronger." Looking out my window at the churchyard where James once preached, and the hospital parking lot where Marcus now held his meetings, I understood this wasn't just about my family anymore. We had become a battlefield in a larger war, a war between faith and doubt, between hope and despair, between love and fear. And somewhere in the midst of it all, my granddaughter's life hung in the balance, waiting for a miracle that could only come through the very thing that seemed to be destroying us: faith. Sarah's hospital room became a microcosm of our family's spiritual warfare. The medical equipment beeped and hummed, monitoring every flutter of her physical condition, but I could sense a deeper battle raging around her soul. The doctors were baffled by her condition, medically stable yet stubbornly unconscious, hovering in a limbo between life and death. Dr. Emily Chen, a neurology specialist brought in from Boston, studied Sarah's brain scans with growing frustration. "Her neural activity is unlike anything I've seen," she confided one afternoon. "It's as if her brain is waiting for something, but we can't determine what." The scans showed sporadic bursts of activity, particularly when James was in the room, but no clear pattern emerged. The nursing staff reported strange occurrences in Sarah's room. Her vital signs would suddenly strengthen during prayer times, only to weaken when Marcus visited with James. Objects would inexplicably move, her favorite stuffed angel repeatedly appearing in her hands, despite being placed on a distant shelf. The room would fill with the scent of roses, the same heavenly fragrance from my encounter with Jesus. James noticed these phenomena, but interpreted them through the lens of Marcus's teachings. The mind creates patterns where none exist, he'd say, his voice carrying a rehearsed quality. We're so desperate for meaning that we project it onto random events. But I caught him late one night, clutching Sarah's hand and whispering, "Please, baby girl, give me a sign. Any sign." Susan documented everything meticulously, much to her brother's annoyance. She kept a detailed log of Sarah's responses, how her heart rate increased when scripture was read, how her brain activity spiked during hymns, how her fingers would sometimes twitch in time with prayers. "There's a pattern here," she insisted. "We just have to help James see it." One particular incident stood out. During a rare moment when both James and Susan were present, a young chaplain stopped by. Before anyone could object, he began reading from Psalms. As he read, the monitors showed Sarah's vital signs strengthening. Then James, influenced by Marcus's recent visit, interrupted sharply, "That's enough. No more religious manipulation." The moment the Bible reading stopped, Sarah's stats plummeted dramatically. Alarms blared as her heart rate dropped. The crash team rushed in, working frantically to stabilize her. James stood frozen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. For a brief moment, I saw my son, the pastor, the believer surface in his eyes. But Marcus arrived minutes later, armed with psychological explanations and studies about the power of suggestion. The moment of potential breakthrough slipped away as James retreated back into his shell of skepticism. Dr. Chen ordered more tests, searching for medical explanations. The results only deepened the mystery. Sarah's brain showed activity patterns that suggested she was fully aware of her surroundings, processing everything happening in her room. "It's almost like she's choosing not to wake up," Dr. Chen admitted, puzzled, as if she's waiting for something specific. I knew what, or rather who, she was waiting for. Jesus had shown me in my vision Sarah's healing was tied to her father's faith. Each time James stepped further into doubt, Sarah slipped further away. Each time a glimmer of his old faith surfaced, her vital signs would strengthen. The spiritual battle manifested physically in other ways. The machines monitoring Sarah would malfunction when Marcus's group held meetings nearby. Her room temperature would drop dramatically during their sessions, only to warm again when prayer groups gathered. Even the skeptical Dr. Chen began noting these environmental anomalies in her reports. One night, while sitting alone with Sarah, I witnessed something extraordinary. A soft golden light, similar to what I'd seen in my encounter with Jesus, filled the room. Sarah's hand moved, reaching out as if trying to touch something I couldn't see. The monitors recorded this movement, but when the doctors reviewed the data, they found nothing unusual in her brain activity during that moment. Grandma Susan whispered the next morning, showing me her phone. "Look at this." She'd installed a prayer app that sent notifications when people around the world were praying for Sarah. The timestamp of the highest concentration of prayers matched exactly with the golden light incident. But for every sign of hope, there seemed to be a counterblow. Marcus convinced James to participate in a documentary about breaking free from religious trauma, using Sarah's condition as an example of how magical thinking harms families in crisis. The film crew's presence in the hospital created new tensions, with Susan threatening legal action to prevent them from filming near Sarah's room. Through it all, Sarah remained unchanged physically, yet I sensed her spiritual battle intensifying. Jesus' words echoed in my mind, "The enemy knows that destroying one family's faith can create ripples that affect countless others." Sarah's condition had become a symbol of faith versus doubt, of miracle versus medicine, of spiritual warfare in our modern world. The breaking point came on a stormy Sunday evening, 3 weeks after my resurrection. Marcus had organized a special Freedom from Faith session in the hospital's conference room, deliberately scheduling it to coincide with the evening church service. James wasn't just attending anymore, he was scheduled to be the main speaker, planning to publicly renounce his former life as a pastor. I watched from Sarah's room as James prepared for his speech, adjusting his tie in the reflection of her window. The same tie, I noticed with a pang, that he'd worn for his first sermon. Thunder rolled outside, and the hospital lights flickered ominously. "You don't have to do this," Susan pleaded, making one last attempt. "Think about what this will do to Sarah, to your congregation, to all the people who still believe in you." James turned, his eyes hard. "That's exactly why I have to do it. No more lies, no more false hope. It's time people heard the truth about religious manipulation, starting with Mom's miracle." The moment he said those words, Sarah's monitors began beeping erratically. Her pulse quickened, her blood pressure dropped, and her brain activity spiked in patterns Dr. Chen had never seen before. It was as if her body was physically reacting to her father's declaration of disbelief. Then something extraordinary happened. As medical staff rushed in to stabilize Sarah, a deafening crack of thunder shook the building. The power went out completely, plunging the hospital into darkness. The backup generators failed to kick in, something the hospital engineers would later say was technically impossible. In the darkness, I saw it, the same golden light that had surrounded Jesus during my near-death experience began emanating from Sarah's bed. It filled the room with a warm, pulsing glow that seemed to push back against the shadows. "What's happening?" James whispered, his carefully constructed skepticism cracking at the sight. Before anyone could respond, Marcus burst into the room. "James, we need to start. The crowd is waiting." He stopped short at the sight of the golden light, then quickly recovered. "It's just an electrical anomaly. The storm is causing." His words were cut off by Sarah's voice, not from her unconscious body, but seemingly from the air around us. "Daddy," it echoed, clear as crystal, "don't go." The medical staff stood frozen. Susan clutched my hand so tight it hurt. James stumbled backward, his face pale. "This isn't real," he muttered. "This can't be real." Marcus sprang into action, grabbing James's arm. "It's a trick. They're using your emotional vulnerability to manipulate you. Remember what we discussed about mass hysteria and group suggestion." But the golden light grew stronger, and with it came that familiar scent of roses. Sarah's voice spoke again. "Daddy, Jesus is here. He never left you." James fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. Years of built-up doubt, anger, and pain seemed to pour out of him. "God," he choked out, "if this is real, if you're really there." Marcus made one final attempt, his voice taking on a strange, almost desperate edge. "Don't let them pull you back into the delusion, James. Think about everything we've worked for, everything we're going to expose." At that moment, I saw what Jesus had warned me about: a darkness gathering around Marcus, a spiritual reality becoming physically manifest. The golden light from Sarah's bed met this darkness in a visible clash of power that made the air itself seem to tremble. "James," I said, my voice carrying an authority that wasn't my own, "remember who you are. Remember whose you are." The power of choice hung in the air. My son stood between light and darkness, between faith and doubt, between his past and the future Marcus offered. In that moment, I saw what Jesus had shown me: how this decision would ripple out beyond our family, affecting countless others who would hear our story. The battle for James's soul reached its climax in that darkened hospital room. The golden light continued to pulse around Sarah's bed, while the shadows surrounding Marcus seemed to grow deeper, more menacing. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, as if nature itself was responding to the spiritual warfare taking place within. "Think about your wife, James," Marcus said, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality. "Think about how religion drove her away, how it's destroying your daughter now. Come with me, and we'll show the world the truth about faith's destructive power." But the mention of Rebecca had an unexpected effect. James straightened up, something shifting in his expression. "No," he said slowly. "Rebecca didn't leave because of faith. She left because I lost mine. Because I stopped being the man she married, the man who believed in something greater than himself." The darkness around Marcus writhed, and his calm demeanor cracked. "Don't be a fool. Your mother's miracle? A hallucination? Your daughter's voice? A trick? These lights? Electrical malfunctions? There's a rational explanation for everything." Just then, Sarah's vital signs began to crash. The monitor's alarms pierced the tense atmosphere, their desperate beeping a countdown to what felt like an approaching doom. Dr. Chen rushed in with her team, but their medical expertise seemed powerless against what was happening. "She's slipping away," Dr. Chen announced, her professional composure cracking. "We're losing her." James looked torn between rushing to his daughter's side and following Marcus. The choice before him was clear: faith or doubt, light or darkness, life or death. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his decision. Then Sarah's voice came again, weaker this time. "Daddy, believe." Something broke in James. He rushed to Sarah's bedside, tears streaming down his face. Falling to his knees, he grabbed her hand and began to pray, not the polished prayers of his pastoral days, but raw, desperate pleading. "God, I'm sorry," he cried out. "I was angry, I was hurt, I blamed you for everything. But I never stopped needing you. Please don't take my daughter. I believe. Help my unbelief." The moment those words left his lips, the same words spoken by another desperate father in the Gospels, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The golden light flared brilliantly, forcing everyone to shield their eyes. The darkness around Marcus recoiled as if struck. "No," Marcus shouted, his voice distorting into something inhuman. "You're throwing away everything we've worked for. Think of all the others we could free from religious bondage." But James wasn't listening anymore. He was focused entirely on Sarah, praying with renewed intensity. Susan joined him, then Dr. Chen, and even some of the nurses. One by one, people in the room felt drawn to join this impromptu prayer circle, their voices rising together in a symphony of faith. Marcus made one last attempt to intervene, but as he stepped forward, the golden light formed what looked like a barrier between him and James. For a brief moment, his face contorted into something ancient and malevolent, the true force behind his freedom from faith movement revealed. "This isn't over," he snarled, backing toward the door. "You can't save them all, Margaret. Doubt will always be stronger than faith." With those words, he fled, taking the unnatural shadows with him. But the victory came at a price. Despite the intensity of prayers, Sarah's condition continued to deteriorate. The monitors showed her heart rate dropping, her oxygen levels falling. Dr. Chen worked frantically, calling out orders to her team, but nothing seemed to help. "Please, God," James sobbed, still clutching his daughter's hand. "I believe now. I truly believe. What more do you want from me?" That's when I remembered Jesus' words during my vision. True faith isn't just about believing. It's about surrendering everything. I understood what had to happen next, and my heart broke for what my son would have to endure. Because sometimes I realized the greatest test of faith isn't in holding on, it's in letting go. At 3:17 a.m., amid prayers and tears, Sarah's heart stopped beating. The monitors flatlined, their harsh tone cutting through the room like a knife. Dr. Chen and her team rushed into action, beginning CPR with practiced precision, but I could sense something different about this crisis, something final. Starting compressions, a nurse called out, "Push 1 of epinephrine." James stood frozen, his face ashen, as medical staff worked to revive his daughter. Susan clung to my wheelchair, her body shaking with silent sobs. The golden light that had filled the room earlier was gone, replaced by the harsh fluorescent glare of emergency medical equipment. "Come on, Sarah," Dr. Chen muttered, sweat beading on her forehead as she continued compressions. "Don't give up on us now." Minutes ticked by. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15. The medical team worked tirelessly, but there was no response. Sarah remained still, her face peaceful as if she were merely sleeping. The same face that had lit up at science fairs, that had beamed with pride when her father preached, that had somehow maintained its innocence even as our family crumbled around her. Finally, Dr. Chen stepped back, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Time of death, 3:32 a.m., she announced, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "I'm so sorry." James's reaction was devastating to witness. He lunged forward, pushing past the medical team to reach Sarah's bed. "No, keep trying. You can't stop. You can't." His voice broke as he gathered his daughter's lifeless body in his arms. "Baby girl, please," he whispered, rocking her gently. "I just found my faith again. I just started believing. This can't be the answer. This can't be what God wants." Susan approached her brother hesitantly, placing a hand on his shoulder. He shrugged it off violently. "Don't," he snarled. "Don't tell me this is God's plan. Don't tell me he works in mysterious ways. She's gone. My baby's gone." The room began to empty as the medical staff quietly withdrew, leaving our family alone with our grief. The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the windows, painting the room in shades of gold and pink, Sarah's favorite colors. The cruel beauty of it felt like a mockery of our pain. I sat in my wheelchair, tears streaming down my face, trying to understand. Jesus had shown me a vision of hope, of restoration. How could this be part of that plan? The doubt that had plagued James now threatened to overwhelm me. Then I noticed something strange. Despite the growing sunlight outside, the room seemed to be getting darker. A heaviness settled in the air, thick and oppressive. I recognized this darkness. It was the same that had surrounded Marcus, but stronger now, feeding on our grief and despair. "James," I called out, my voice urgent. "This isn't over. Remember what Jesus showed me. Remember what we're fighting for." But my son was beyond hearing. He had retreated into himself, his body curved protectively around Sarah's still form, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The darkness seemed to gather around him, whispering words of despair I couldn't quite hear but could feel in my soul. Susan turned to me, her face streaked with tears. "Mom, what do we do? How can this be right? How can this be part of God's plan?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time since my resurrection, since my encounter with Jesus, I felt truly lost. The weight of my divine mission pressed down on me like a physical burden, but in that moment, I was just a grandmother watching her family shatter under the weight of unbearable loss. The morning sun continued to rise outside, but inside room 317 of Millbrook General Hospital, darkness reigned. We had lost more than Sarah that morning. We had lost our hope, our direction, and possibly our faith. Or had we? The days following Sarah's death plunged our family into a darkness deeper than any we had known. James disappeared from the hospital that morning, leaving behind his pastor's collar and a note that simply read, "God is dead to me." No one knew where he had gone, though rumors circulated that he had been seen with Marcus at a hotel on the outskirts of town. Susan threw herself into funeral arrangements with almost manic energy, as if keeping busy could somehow keep her grief at bay. She insisted on planning a traditional Christian service, even though she knew James would object. Sarah loved church, she said firmly, arranging lilies around the small white casket. She would want this. But James didn't show up for the funeral. The empty front pew where he should have sat seemed to mock everything we believed in. The church was packed, even Dr. Chen and several nurses attended, but the absence of Sarah's father left a void that no amount of hymns or prayers could fill. I watched my son spiral into darkness from afar, receiving updates from concerned community members. He had joined Marcus's inner circle, becoming the face of their anti-faith movement. His story, the pastor turned skeptic who lost his daughter to religious delusion, became their most powerful weapon. "If God exists," he declared in a viral video Marcus posted, "he's a monster who feeds on the suffering of children. My daughter died because we waited for a miracle instead of accepting reality. I won't let other families make the same mistake." The video hit our community like a bomb. Church attendance dropped. Parents pulled their children from Sunday school. Local news stations ran stories about the crisis of faith in Millbrook. Marcus's following grew, with James's testimony serving as their cornerstone. Susan was devastated. "How can he do this?" she sobbed one evening. "How can he use Sarah's death to destroy everything she loved?" I understood, though, in a way that broke my heart. James wasn't just rejecting faith, he was trying to kill it, as if destroying everyone else's belief could somehow justify his own loss of it. Each person he freed from religion was a vindication of his pain, a confirmation that his daughter's death hadn't been in vain. The darkness that had been growing since Sarah's death seemed to follow him everywhere. People who attended his talks with Marcus reported feeling cold, depressed, hopeless. Some experienced nightmares. Others found themselves questioning not just their faith, but their very reason for living. One night, a young mother came to my house in tears. "I heard your son speak today," she said. "He made so much sense. But when I got home, I couldn't remember why I loved my children. It was like all the joy had been drained from the world. What's happening to us?" I knew what was happening. The enemy Jesus had warned me about wasn't just taking my son, it was using him as a weapon against the entire community's faith. Each soul he helped Marcus free was another victory for the darkness. The final blow came when James announced he was selling the family home, the house where Sarah had grown up, where she had played in the garden and decorated Christmas cookies. "I'm leaving Millbrook," he told Susan coldly when she protested. This town is poisoned with memories and superstition. That night, alone in my room, I felt the weight of failure crushing me. Jesus had trusted me with a mission, had shown me a future where faith triumphed. Instead, I was watching my son become an agent of the very darkness we were supposed to fight. But as I sat there wrestling with my despair, I felt a familiar warmth begin to fill the room. The scent of roses, the same scent from my encounter with Jesus, wafted through the air. And somehow I knew this darkness, this pain, this apparent defeat, it wasn't the end of our story. It was the setup for a miracle. The revelation came exactly 40 days after Sarah's death. I was sitting in my garden, the same spot where I used to read Bible stories to Sarah, when the golden light returned stronger than ever before. The familiar presence of Jesus filled the space, and with it came not just comfort, but understanding. "Margaret," his voice resonated in my soul. "It's time. The enemy has played his final hand." The vision he showed me this time was crystal clear. I saw Sarah not dead, but in a state of divine protection. Her soul had been preserved, kept safe from the darkness that sought to use her death as a weapon against faith. What we had witnessed in the hospital wasn't a final ending, but a temporary separation. "But the body," I whispered. "We buried her." "Did you not read of Lazarus?" His voice carried both gentle reproach and infinite love. "Death is not the end when I am present. Tomorrow, Marcus plans to hold his largest rally yet. James will publicly curse my name before the entire town. That is when I will reveal my glory." The instructions that followed were specific and urgent. I was to gather Susan and go to the cemetery at dawn, before the rally. We were to bring Dr. Chen. Her scientific testimony would be crucial. And most importantly, we had to pray that James would feel drawn to visit his daughter's grave one last time before denouncing his faith completely. As the vision faded, I felt something being pressed into my hand, a small object that hadn't existed moments before. It was Sarah's favorite hair ribbon, the one we had buried her in, but it was warm as if it had just been worn, carrying that same scent of roses that accompanied Jesus' presence. I called Susan immediately. She arrived within minutes, still in her nurse's scrubs, skeptical but desperate for hope. When I showed her the ribbon, her hands trembling as she touched it, she broke down in tears. "It's still warm," she whispered. "And it smells like heaven," I finished, "like the presence of God." We spent the night in prayer, not just for Sarah's resurrection, but for James's salvation. The darkness that had gripped our town through Marcus's influence had grown powerful, feeding on doubt, grief, and anger. Breaking its hold would require more than just a miracle, it would require a father's renewed faith. News of Marcus's rally had spread far beyond Millbrook. Journalists from national networks were arriving, drawn by the story of the pastor turned atheist who would publicly renounce God in the town where his daughter had died. Marcus had planned everything perfectly, or so he thought. What he couldn't have known was that God had orchestrated an even greater testimony. The very public nature of James's planned renunciation would serve to make the miracle to come even more powerful, reaching far beyond our small town. As the night deepened, more signs appeared. The roses in my garden, dead since Sarah's passing, suddenly bloomed, filling the air with their fragrance. The stars seemed to pulse with an inner light, and a warm breeze carried whispers of hope through the trees. Dawn was approaching, and with it the moment of truth. Either my vision would prove true and our faith would be vindicated in the most spectacular way, but I couldn't allow myself to consider the alternative. Jesus had promised, and his promises never fail. Dawn broke over Millbrook Cemetery with an otherworldly glow. Susan, Dr. Chen, and I arrived to find James already there, kneeling at Sarah's grave. He looked haggard, broken, a man preparing to publicly reject everything he once held sacred. "James," I called softly. He turned, his eyes hollow. "Don't try to stop me, Mom," he said. "In 2 hours, I'm going to tell the world the truth about your supposed miracle, about all of it." Before I could respond, the air around us began to shimmer with that familiar golden light. Dr. Chen gasped, her scientific mind struggling to process what her eyes were seeing. The light concentrated around Sarah's grave, growing more intense with each passing moment. Then we heard Sarah's voice, clear as a bell. "Daddy, it's time to come home." The ground beneath us trembled. The marble headstone began to glow from within, and the morning air filled with the scent of roses. James stumbled backward, his face a mask of confusion and desperate hope. "This is impossible," Dr. Chen whispered, her phone out, recording everything. "The electromagnetic readings are off the scale." The earth over Sarah's grave began to move, not violently, but as gently as a child's blanket being pulled back. And there she was, Sarah, sitting up in her burial dress, the same ribbon I'd been given now glowing in her hair. Her eyes opened, bright with life and love. "Hi, Daddy," she said simply, as if waking from a nap. "Jesus says it's not too late." James fell to his knees, his entire body shaking. The carefully constructed walls of skepticism, the months of anger and bitterness, crumbled in an instant. He reached for his daughter with trembling hands, afraid she might dissolve like a dream. But Sarah was solid, warm, alive. She threw her arms around her father's neck, and the sound of his sobbing echoed through the cemetery. Dr. Chen, her hands shaking, continued to document everything, tears streaming down her face. "The body shows no signs of decomposition," she reported into her phone. "Temperature normal, pulse strong, pupils responsive. This defies every known law of biology." Susan had fallen to her knees in prayer, words of gratitude mixing with tears of joy. Around us, the golden light formed what looked like a protective dome, shielding us from the outside world for this sacred moment. "I'm sorry," James wept, clutching Sarah. "I'm so sorry. I lost my way. I almost—" "It's okay," Daddy, Sarah soothed, running her small hand through his hair. "Jesus showed me everything while I was with him. He never left you. He was just waiting for you to remember who you are." The light began to fade as the sun rose higher, but its warmth remained. We could hear cars arriving at the cemetery, early comers for Marcus's rally, no doubt. But something told me there would be no rally today. Instead, there would be testimony of a different kind. "Dr. Chen," I said quietly, "you have your evidence. The world needs to see what happened here." She nodded, still recording. "As a scientist, I'm supposed to maintain objectivity," she said, her voice trembling. "But as a witness to this, how can anyone deny the divine?" James stood, holding Sarah in his arms, his face transformed by joy and renewed faith. The broken, bitter man who had planned to denounce God was gone. In his place stood a father and believer reborn, holding living proof of God's power and love. The news of Sarah's resurrection spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By noon, the cemetery was packed with witnesses, journalists, and skeptics turned believers. Marcus's planned rally transformed into something entirely different, a spontaneous testimony service where James, still holding Sarah tightly, shared the truth about his journey through darkness and back to light. "I let grief blind me," he told the crowd, his voice carrying the same power it had in his preaching days, but with newfound humility. "I traded my faith for anger, my hope for bitterness, but God never gave up on me. He used my own daughter's death and resurrection to show me that miracles don't just happen in ancient texts, they happen here, now, when we dare to believe." Dr. Chen's video evidence went viral within hours. Major news networks descended on our small town, their cameras capturing Sarah's perfect health, her joyful reunions with classmates, and the undeniable transformation in her father. Scientific experts were baffled by the medical data, a body that showed no signs of having been dead for 40 days, DNA tests confirming her identity beyond doubt. Marcus disappeared the day of the miracle, his darkness-driven mission crumbling in the face of undeniable divine intervention. His followers, freed from his influence, began their own journeys back to faith. Many sought counseling from James, who understood their struggles better than anyone. The changes in our family were profound. James returned to ministry, but with a different approach. His sermons now spoke not just of faith, but of doubt's role in strengthening it. He shared his story openly, helping others navigate their own spiritual struggles. Sarah sat in the front pew every Sunday, her presence a living testament to God's power. Susan's faith deepened in its own way. Her experiences as a nurse combined with witnessing the miracle gave her a unique perspective on the intersection of science and faith. She started a support group for medical professionals struggling to reconcile their scientific training with spiritual experiences. Our church became a pilgrimage site of sorts, with people traveling from around the world to hear our story. But more importantly, it became a sanctuary for doubters, seekers, and those wrestling with their faith. James welcomed them all, understanding their questions because they had once been his own. The golden light that had accompanied my visions never fully left. Sometimes, during particularly powerful moments of worship or prayer, visitors would catch glimpses of it. The scent of roses would waft through the sanctuary, reminding us of the thin veil between heaven and earth. Sarah returned to her normal life with remarkable ease, though changed by her experience. Jesus showed me so much love, she would say simply when asked about her time on the other side. He just wants everyone to know they're never alone, even in their darkest moments. As for me, I watched it all unfold with profound gratitude. My near-death experience and the visions that followed had served their purpose, not just in restoring my family's faith, but in touching countless other lives. The prophecy Jesus had given me had come true, though not in the way any of us had expected. Looking back on everything that happened in Millbrook, I understand now that our story was never just about my family. It was about the eternal battle between faith and doubt, between light and darkness, and how God can use our deepest wounds to create the most powerful testimonies. The message Jesus gave me has proven true in ways I never imagined. Every day, I receive letters from people around the world who've been touched by our experience. Many share their own struggles with doubt, their fears about believing, their questions about why God allows suffering. James answers each one personally, sharing how his journey through darkness ultimately led to greater light. Sarah has become a beacon of hope in her own right. Now back in school, she shares her experience with a wisdom far beyond her years. Heaven is real, she tells anyone who asks, and it's filled with more love than we can imagine. Her simple faith, tested by death itself, touches hearts that scholarly arguments never could. Dr. Chen published her findings in several medical journals, sparking intense debate in the scientific community. While some dismissed her evidence, many were forced to acknowledge that some things transcend current scientific understanding. She continues her practice, now approaching her work with what she calls holy curiosity, the understanding that science and faith can coexist and even enhance each other. The roses in my garden bloom year-round now, defying natural seasons. Their fragrance serves as a constant reminder of Jesus' presence, drawing visitors who come seeking their own encounters with the divine. Some report feeling the same golden light that accompanied my visions, while others experience deep emotional healing just sitting among the flowers. Our church has become known as a place where doubters are welcome, where questions aren't feared, and where faith is strengthened through honest wrestling with uncertainty. James often says, God is big enough to handle our doubts and loving enough to meet us in them. The most powerful message of all, perhaps, is how God can use our deepest pain for his greatest purpose. What seemed like our family's destruction, my near-death experience, Sarah's death, James's crisis of faith, became the very things God used to bring healing to countless others. To those who read our story, I want to share what Jesus showed me. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting even when the questions seem overwhelming. Doubt isn't the opposite of faith, it's often the path to stronger faith. And miracles still happen, not just in ancient stories, but here and now, in our own lives. The golden light still appears sometimes, especially during moments of deep prayer or worship. When it does, it reminds us that the veil between heaven and earth is thinner than we think, and that God is always working, even when we can't see it. Our story continues to unfold. Each day brings new testimonies of lives changed, faith restored, and hope renewed. And through it all, the message remains the same: God's love is stronger than death, more powerful than doubt, and more persistent than our deepest questions. As Sarah often says, with the simple wisdom of a child who has seen heaven, just remember Jesus never lets go, even when we do. And that, perhaps, is the greatest miracle of all. If this story of faith, miracles, and redemption has touched your heart, please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your own experiences with faith and divine intervention. Support our mission of spreading hope and inspiration by subscribing to our channel, and don't forget to like this video. Share it with friends and family who might need a reminder that miracles still happen and that God's love never fails. Every subscription, like, and share helps us reach more people with these powerful testimonies of faith. Join our growing community of believers and seekers as we explore more extraordinary stories of God's grace.